So I'd also like to, of course, do an acknowledgement of country here today. So I wish to acknowledge the Ngunnawal people as traditional custodians of the land in which we are meeting, recognise any other people or families with connections to the lands of the ACT and region, wish to acknowledge and respect their continuing culture and the contribution they make to the life of this city and this region. I would also like to acknowledge and welcome any other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who may be attending today. All right, thanks and welcome, Rachael. I think just driven in from Sydney, so welcome. Now we're going to start with Noam Angrist online. We're then going to pass to Rachael Meager, and then Japoi Panti in order. We'll do about sort of 15-minute presentations, and then we'll have lots of time for Q&A. We'll do the Q&A as a panel. So please, as we're going through, jot down your questions for either individuals or the panel as a whole. Now, Noam has an incredibly impressive CV. Noam's interests centre on bridging the gap between rigorous evidence that can enable youth to thrive and translation into scaled intervention and policy. He's executive director, therefore, and co-founder of the Youth Impact, one of the largest youth-led NGOs dedicated to scaling up health and education programs backed by rigorous evidence. This organisation, headquartered in Botswana, has reached over 100,000 youth across 10 countries, has run randomised controlled trials in partnership with JPAL, with partnerships with UNICEF, USAID and Brookings. He's also a fellow at the University of Oxford, published in a variety of peer-reviewed journals such as Nature, Journal of Economic Perspectives, consulted with the World Bank chief economist, and particularly on this World Bank Human Capital Index, I'm sure you're all aware of, including the harmonised learning outcomes, learning adjusted years of schooling, which of course has been adopted as an indicator by development organisations globally to track education systems at country level. I'll stop there. And Noam, can I test that you can hear us? We can hear you.
Yes, now I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can indeed, and apologies that you couldn't hear a little bit of my intro, but over to you for your presentation. I think you've got about 15 minutes, and we can get in touch with Noam separately, and we'll let you know roughly when we're at time. Thanks.
Great. Well, thank you, everyone. Can you see me?
Yes. Yes.
Great. Sorry, I've got some terrible backlighting, but I hope you can still see me. Great to see everyone, and thanks for having me. And I wish I could be there in person next time. I'm just going to share my screen here. Let's see if this comes through. Okay. Is that showing up?
Yeah. Very good.
Great. Good. Yeah. Well, it's great to join you. I'll start by actually, I have the privilege of having collaborated with both Japoi and Rachael and Claire, who are all there. So kind of joint related work, but I'll start by just giving a bit of an overview on evidence on education in general in low and middle income countries. Recently wrote a paper on summarizing and looking at over 200 different evaluations in education over the last few decades, trying to look at what are the most cost-effective ways to improve learning using a unified metric. So I'll speak about that. And then I'm also going to connect the dot to a new effort that I'm involved in as the academic director of the What Works Hub for Global Education, which is a follow-on to the RISE effort, which actually I know GSAT was involved in. And so I'll make a bit of a segue into that, which is also related to research that's going to come up on the rest of the panel. Okay, so how to improve education outcomes most efficiently. This is both a research product, but it's also informed a recent policy effort, which I'll speak about, which is a co-convening between the World Bank, UNICEF, USAID, and the World Bank to try to take a stand on what are these most cost-effective approaches. It's culminated in a series of flagship reports and guidance that's actually gone through those institutions. So why use a unified metric to review the evidence? And what is the metric we're using? It is learning adjusted years of schooling. So let me motivate why we're using this. Typically, a lot of education interventions, as I'm sure folks are familiar with, have relied on schooling, both at the macro level and the micro level. So both kind of seeing if countries have made progress in education, we often have looked at whether children are in school, and similar with impact evaluations. The problem is schooling is not learning. This is a phrase that I'm sure folks might be familiar with, and if not, hopefully you are now. Lant Pritchett has kind of famously, touted this phrase and many others. Going to school does not necessarily yield learning. Actually, a bit shocking how little learning is happening in lots of schooling systems. So here's an example. Data from Kenya, Tanzania, and Uganda shows that 3/4 of grade 3 students who've been in school for multiple years still can't read a simple sentence. So that's pretty shocking. They're not really getting much out of those 3 years of school. Here's another statistic and figure on this. So you can see on the left-hand side is enrollment rates that are increasing all over the world. So that's good. Enrollment is increasing and high. On the right-hand side is learning outcomes. And you can see those learning outcomes are not budging. So not only are learning levels low, they haven't progressed in decades. It's kind of shocking. And folks, I'm sure, have talked, yesterday was the famous PISA day. And there's some really sad news in some countries like the US where things have actually gone backwards, not just not progressed. This right-hand figure is based on data that I was involved in making comparable around the world because we don't have a kind of global common assessment. The closest thing is PISA, but that doesn't capture all countries. So we made learning outcomes as comparable as we could all over the world, covering 164 countries. That was work that fed into the World Bank Human Capital Index, and we published in Nature. So that's what enabled us to produce this figure, which tells a sad story on the learning crisis. The learning adjusted years of schooling aim to not just use schooling, but actually capture this really crucial feature of whether the children are learning. So we don't assume that schooling leads to learning. So we really do explicitly capture both. Here's how it works in simple form. You'll take a country, let's say South Korea, and you'll see the number of years of schooling that country gets, let's say about 15 years of schooling. And then you'll just count it for how much learning the children are actually getting relative to a global high performance benchmark. So that might be Singapore in this case, which often does well. It could be an artificial benchmark as well, just getting 625 on these PISA assessments. And you can see there's a small discount here because the children are largely learning by global benchmarks. So there's not a huge discount for the learning adjusted years of schooling. By contrast, South Africa, where children are getting a good amount of schooling, about 11 to 12 years, there's a huge discount. Children are not learning very much. And that actually goes all the way to 6 learning adjusted years of schooling. So really quite a far cry from 12 years of high quality education, which is a global goal. So one way of thinking about this vertical discount is a measure of productivity. How productive is a year of schooling in terms of achieving learning? And on the horizontal is kind of a bit more of a comparable exchange rate. So a year of school is worth something very different in different countries. This gives us a slightly more comparable metric because now you're accounting for what it's worth in terms of learning at least. Very simple calculation, and it was designed to be simple. It's just taking the year of schooling times learning outcomes in a given country relative to learning outcomes in the high performance country. And part of the effort in designing these metrics is actually to not make them more complex than they need to be. Sometimes these indicators are sausages. They have 50 things that have gone into them, and it might taste good, but no one knows what went in or what came out. We didn't want that. We wanted something clear, transparent, simple, but that still gave us something more meaningful and comparable. Okay, so that's learning adjusted years of schooling. Capturing learning as well as schooling both matter. Easy to understand and interpret. Actionable, it demonstrates where governments can act. They can say, well, focus on schooling or learning. It's not this 50 indicator index. And it's been adopted as a global measure by various global institutions like the World Bank, FCDO, USAID, UNICEF, etc. Okay, so that's the country level. Now I want to zoom into the specific interventions and policies that improve learning adjusted years of schooling. So we looked at over 200 studies and impact evaluations from over 50 low and middle income countries. So a really comprehensive review and the most comprehensive review of the literature to date. The last big review like this that we've seen was in 2016. So it's been some time. And there's been hundreds of impact evaluations since then. This gives you a sense of the distribution of countries where we're pulling some of this work in low and middle income countries. And I'm cutting to the chase. Here's what we're finding in terms of cost effectiveness. And one thing I should also highlight is there is a focus on cost. So a lot of time we look at effectiveness, but we don't account for cost. But that's crucial, especially if the goal is to give some guidance to government and policy institutions. Cost is crucial. So a novel piece of this work is also that we captured as much cost and as comparable cost data as we could on the widest scale. Here's what we're seeing. So on the bottom there is a note of caution. A lot of programs that are very popular in education systems generate almost zero learning adjusted years of schooling. Things like general skills teacher training, providing more inputs into the classrooms, additional textbooks, reducing class size, laptops, very popular interventions, cost transfers, very effective for social protection, not so effective actually to improve learning. So that's a bit of an interesting finding. So these are very popular approaches, take up a sizable chunk of government expenditure, but don't work very well. That's probably why we see that flat line that I showed earlier of things not really improving, because the stuff that doesn't work is the stuff that's most popular. In contrast, there is some hope here. I've shared a bit of doom and gloom. Kids aren't learning, things don't work. There are some things that do work, which is great. Things like targeting instruction by learning level rather than age or grade. And we'll go into this more. I know this is going to come up later in the panel. Really cost-effective approach. Generating about 3 learning adjusted years of schooling per $100 spent. So that's really good. If you remember that South Africa example I gave, that's half of the whole system level gap. This is not a niche gain. This is a sizable gain if it can be achieved at scale. So some really effective and cost-effective stuff. That's one approach. Other approaches like structured pedagogy are getting a lot of attention, also quite effective. And recent evidence on using mobile phones to reach students wherever they are through tutoring that also teaches to the child level. Again, that's something that we're going to hear about the panel today, also extremely cost effective. So there are some approaches that can work. And part of the shift that we need to see is a shift from the ineffective to the cost effective in this type of analysis, hopefully. So there is growing evidence on what works in education. More impact evaluations, lessons from various efforts like RISE, like the Global Education Evidence Advisory Panel, which is that policy effort that I shared that reviews the global evidence in education. This is the panel that I was discussing, co-convened by the World Bank, UNICEF, USAID, and FCDO, making these recommendations. This analysis actually fed directly into that. So we have a sense of things that can work. Okay, and this is the series of flagship reports there that policy effort that builds on this research effort has produced. So happy to share these. This is a bit of a description on the Global Education Evidence Advisory Panel. It's kind of a first, actually. We have these things in climate, the IPCC. We have it in health. We haven't had it as much in education. So it's really a welcome development, and it's been really exciting to be a part of this work. Now, of course, it's, you want this evidence on what works, but it always has to be adapted and customized to local conditions. So it shouldn't be applied blindly. And so this is a framework for thinking about, how you can take what is the local need, take the lesson from the evidence, apply it locally and implement it locally. And in some cases, the evidence will be relevant, and in some cases it won't. This is not to say these things will work all the time everywhere, but we're not starting from zero. We have some information on what can work and what can't work, and we probably want to build on that. This report comes up with some pretty punchy bottom lines. What is a great buy? These things like teaching at the right level, targeting instruction to kids' learning level. What is a good buy? Things like early childhood development. What is promising but has limited evidence? And frankly, what are bad buys? What should we not be doing? What have been bad investments? Things like dumping laptops into schools are famously bad, and we should stop doing that. And so it has a pretty set of punchy policy relevant messages, and governments have really loved this, actually, because they feel it's clear. It takes a stand. Sometimes we say on the one hand this, on the other hand this, and that leaves decision makers with no sense of where to go, actually. So it's had really good reception from policymakers. a series of products. So it's not one report, it's various reports, and it's more than reports. It's actually working through the institutional infrastructure. So happy to share more on that. Now I'm going to make a bit of a pivot, which I think transitions nicely to some of the work that will come up on the rest of the panel. I'm going to talk about the What Works Hub for Global Education. So this is an effort that's building on RISE for those that are familiar with that. And this is saying, okay, so kids are in school and they're not learning. A bunch of stuff doesn't work, but some stuff does work. Now, how do we take the stuff that does work and get it working at scale and working with governments and implemented really well and generate a bit of a method to the madness of implementation, a bit of implementation science, so that we can actually improve children's learning. So that's really the focus of the What Works Hub for Global Education. And it feeds in really nicely to work that will come up on this panel, which really takes implementation quite seriously and quantifies it and creates a bit of method to the madness, actually. Just to share a little bit about this effort, it's a £30 million investment by FCDO over 6 years with this big piece on implementation science, a mix of quant and qual, but a healthy mix of both. Also a piece on facilitating and supporting evidence use and consumption, and as well as generation within government ministries, and synthesis, like this kind of analysis that I just shared that's feeding into these global policy recommendations, both generating primary research and evidence that's practical and applied, and also synthesizing the body of evidence. It's got a great consortium of partners, so I can share more here. And it also has a set of strategic partners, which include FCDO, the Gates Foundation, and a series of others. And if there's interest, actually would love to have conversations with colleagues at DSAT about joining hands and joining forces, because I know DSAT was a key partner in RISE as well. So I'll wrap up there and looking forward to the discussion.
No, I'm hoping you can hear me. Yes. Look, that was absolutely fantastic and is a great scene setter for our discussion here today. We're going to dive into a bit more evidence, bear with us. But I think it's really important to really to look at some of the detail, to then come up to some of these broader points that Noam was talking about, and then have a discussion. And really, when we go to the Q&A session, I mean, it's a pretty small room. Many practitioners in the room, you know. I mean, don't think it's just it's a one-way discussion with the panel. You know, we really want to hear what works and your perspectives, and particularly those of you from developing countries, working in developing countries, working in the systems that, you know, this really is all about systems and how we get systems delivering. So let's make that a real discussion. All right, so next I have the great pleasure of welcoming Rachael Meager, absolutely fantastic, Associate Professor of Economics at the University of New South Wales, research interest in development economics and econometrics more broadly, works Bayesian, passionate, I think I could probably say, about Bayesian modelling of treatment effect heterogeneity at multiple levels with data sets and literatures. Absolutely hugely impressive list as soon as I see American Economic Journal and various other really heavyweight economic journals on anyone's CV. It blows me away. So really great to have your work here today in the education space. And I know there's a lot of people can't wait to hear what you've got to say. Thank you. Over to you, Rachael. Cheers.
Awesome. Sure. Great. Okay. Thank you guys so much. Sorry for sliding in the last minute. It's so cool to be here. And I just want to echo what Rob said, like, this is not a one-way street. Like, you know, I'm going to be talking today about how implementation really matters. And this is based on work that Noam and I have done together. But it really slots into my broader academic agenda, which is about when we are trying to say something works or doesn't work. It's easy to say that, but, you know, these interventions occur in particular contexts. And so even if they were implemented all the same, there would still be contextual factors that play a role in what they do to the people that we, you know, serve them to. But moreover, what we found in this project, which I want to take you through at kind of a high level, is that the way that programs are implemented is also obviously different in different settings. And that's not something that is secondary. It's actually primarily important to how we understand policy and impact. And it's been relatively understudied in the academic literature. In my experience, policymakers already understand how important this is. But what we want to do is kind of bring the frameworks together and say, like, there's formal econometric ways we can actually study this. And so let's dive into that. Oh, if I could work there we go. Okay, so in this paper, we're looking at targeted instruction, which is that great buy that Noam was just talking about. So having lots of evidence, rigorous evidence, in various developing contexts, by really careful researchers showing that it does have a positive impact. But the treatment effects that we're actually measuring vary hugely across these settings. So, Noam was showing you a sort of an average, but you can even see already in the graphic that he showed that there are some differences in those treatment effects. So when that's the case, we want to understand why that is. And so what we do in this project is look at the evidence from all the various studies and try to aggregate or synthesize that picture together, not just to get an average, but to understand the variation in that effect. And then moreover, what we find in this project is that accounting for differences in the implementation of these programs is actually essential to generalize treatment effects across settings. So it's actually, this is the primary factor. And we really did not, think that would be the case going in necessarily. We have other variables that we're interested in. Baseline level of learning already, in theory would be quite important. But we actually found that implementation is much more central in the data set that we have. But of course, when I'm looking at aggregating evidence across contexts, I can only really tell you correlation, right? Like there's differences in the context, there's differences in implementation, there's differences in the treatment effect, but it's not clear what's causing what in this situation. So with youth impact in Botswana, we actually ran a new RCT showing that indeed, if we change the implementation or improve the implementation, we will get a bigger impact on children's learning. So that was pretty exciting for us. Okay, so just to give you a sense of what we're basing all of this on, we've got 8 existing teaching at the right level evaluations collated in 3 papers already across 5 contexts. So many different Indian states as well as Kenya. There are some other evaluations, but for these we were able to get the microdata, and that's really important when we're talking about implementation because not all of these papers report implementation variables or even collected them. So we're looking at a couple of key variables, baseline student attainment being one of the key contextual variables, the take-up rate among students, like do students actually attend these programs or not? And this actually varies a lot from 8 to 90%. So we're looking at potentially quite a lot of gains on the table there. And then there's this delivery model, which is whether the program's taught by teachers or volunteers. So we're going to consider in this paper and in this talk 2 types of treatment effects, the intention to treat effect, which is just we ran the program in your area and we just want to see what the impact of that is on learning in the area. And then there's treatment untreated. So that is the students that actually attended in that case and that would not have attended, obviously, otherwise, if the program was not there. But of course, that distinction's a little simplistic already, and I'm going to go into that a little bit more as well. We're also going to look at some Bayesian methods for looking at how we can correlate the effects on a variety of these different factors. And the main outcome that we're looking at here is an average of literacy and numeracy attainment among the children in a test that's like the ASA test. Okay, so the first thing that we see is if we look at the intention to treat effects, so this is just not accounting for like whether the students came or not, but we just offer the program. In fact, students did come, but it did vary. And so this here we have split by whether in the top panel, teachers of the existing schools implemented the program, in the bottom panel, whether volunteer instructors implemented the program. And the red diamonds are the averages in each of these 2 delivery models. And then the green is the overall average. So what you can see here is we're looking, in fact, at the outcome measured in standard deviation. So the overall average is 0.19 standard deviations effect size. That's quite large. That's quite impressive. I come from studying like credit market interventions, which you don't get an effect size big. So that was good. But you can see there's quite a lot of heterogeneity here, especially in the volunteer delivery program. So what if, that's really because students are less likely to attend or something like that. So why don't we just look at students, the treatment on the treated, the students who actually attended the programs. So if we do that, you can see that already a lot of the heterogeneity in the volunteer set has disappeared. So this was really exciting when we saw that. You very rarely see this when you're doing evidence aggregation. Like usually you change stuff and nothing changes. So that was quite exciting. And the average is also larger, which is what we would expect if some students are not attending, which, as I said, is the situation. But of course, like this is us kind of blocking up the data set in a way that made sense to us ex ante. It would be more rigorous to put all of the variables that we're interested in into a meta regression and actually see what the correlations are. So what we're going to do, the paper has a more detailed series of reports, but what I want to show here is the pooled estimate, or the sort of effective, the average program, conditioning on a variety of different factors. And what you can see, for example, if you look at the TOT results, which are a little bit further over in the pink-blue spectrum, you can see that even when we're accounting for lots of different things like baseline, that type of stuff, you really get this dramatic increase in precision from the delivery model. So it does look like indeed it's sort of volunteers versus teachers is a big predictor of the treatment effect. And you're not getting very much more by conditioning on baseline as well, or in fact, you don't get very much precision from conditioning on baseline learning levels. So that's kind of where we started at. Obviously, these are just different ways to look at the patterns in the literature. And so that's kind of difficult to interpret in a sense. So it looks like baseline learning and country context are less important than program take-up and delivery, which is suggestive that program take-up and delivery are kind of decisive in determining treatment effects. But there's a couple of problems. In fact, there's literally two. So the first is the analysis I just showed you doesn't really account, or doesn't account at all, for the fact that take-up measures or program fidelity or delivery are themselves random variables measured with error. And so they also need to be treated with the same care and respect that we would treat the outcome variable. And if we don't do that, like technically we're going to be making mistakes about how certain we are about these adjustments that we're making based on implementation. So what we're going to do, and I'm going to show you this quite briefly, is a new joint model of uncertainty on all the variables. And that's going to lead us to, I think, some conceptual clarifications that I hope may be useful more broadly, which is why I'm going to go through them. And then, of course, that adjustment for the uncertainty would still just be a correlation, so that I'm going to briefly take you through the randomized trial that was done in Botswana. So the new joint model of effects and implementation, I think, has a number of framework or conceptual contributions that I hope would be helpful. And of course, we're interested in feedback if you don't think it's helpful. So the first is that implementation is in fact a multidimensional random variable that itself can be measured. So there's not just one aspect of implementation, right? So in our case, like students have to take the program up, so the students have to attend the classes. But then also, we're talking about targeted instruction. So that means that the teacher or the volunteer who's delivering the program has to, in fact, assess the students correctly. And then, if they assess students correctly, has to target the instruction correctly to the level of the students. Anybody here who teaches knows that's really hard to do. We can't assume that that's just done perfectly without any support. There could be certainly different institutional environments that provide more or less support for teachers in doing that. And moreover, we know a lot about how these implementation factors actually influence outcomes, which is that they have a specific multiplicative relationship. So if students don't turn up to the class can't help them if no one turns up. If the teachers don't assess their level, they can't target the instruction to their level. So we're ending up with this multiplicative relationship. It sort of dials up and down the effect that the program can have. It's not a linear relationship. It's not additive. And so that is different to how we tend to like to think about things in econometrics. So we're going to account for that. We're going to build this multiplicative relationship, and we can actually measure these implementation variables. We do measure them with noise. If we don't account for that, we're going to have bias. So now we're going to account for it. So what we're going to do is aggregate the information on the effects and the implementation. And And to do that, I want you to think of, I promise this is the most annoying technical slide. We want to think of a set of different program contexts, which we're going to index by J, so J1 through capital J, and we've got three relevant objects. The first thing we want to think about is an implementation factor, and you can have actually multiple of these, but this is one of them. And we're going to call that MJ, and that's the extent or proportion to which the program was effectively implemented. So if you think of MJ as take up, then MJ equals 1 would be all the students attended, all the students took the program up, 0, no students. Similarly, if there was perfect adherence to assessment and targeting, that would be another MJ, that would be 1, but it's totally reasonable. In fact, I think most of us that have tried to teach well sometimes come out with an M equals 0.7 sometimes, or 0.4 on a bad day. Like, you just don't always have the same quality of implementation. And you need to know that. It's not saying that it's bad necessarily, but you'd want to track that. So because there's this potential for differential implementation, there's actually no longer just one treatment effect. In fact, there's at least two objects. So we want to refer to the latent treatment effect and the realized treatment effect. So the latent treatment effect, we're going to call theta J, is the impact that's achievable when the program is fully implemented. The realized treatment effect is the observed impact of the program in a given setting, which is the latent treatment effect times the implementation factor. So you might think, who really cares about latent treatment effects? The realized treatment effect is what happened to the people in that setting. That's true. That's what happened to them in the past. If you assume that implementation can't be changed, then that is the only object that you'd be interested in. But if implementation can be changed, if MJ can be changed, then the realized treatment effect can be changed. And in fact, latent effects can be identified and can be changed if MJ is measured and MJ can be changed, and they can. This also matters not just for this average effect or understanding the effect in future versions of the program, but for understanding the variation in the treatment effects across settings. So actually show in the paper that the latent treatment effects are not identified from the realized treatment effects, nor is the generalizability of the program across settings without information on implementation. So what we're going to do now is build a Bayesian hierarchical model that decomposes each of the realized treatment effects into an implementation metric and a latent treatment effect, which we can uncover. And we're going to actually do that with two different types of implementation metrics. I've got take up as M1. We have lots of data on take up. Then I have program fidelity as M2. We only have 3 studies that measured program fidelity, mostly by observing, having expert or other instructors observe instructors actually doing the program. So what I'm going to show you here is if I go here for all the average across all types of delivery models and just look at the latent treatment effects in panel A, what I'm seeing here is that I'm starting to get back to the level of the treatment untreated, but it's somewhat attenuated. So what that suggests is that I do have uncertainty in how I'm measuring implementation. And that uncertainty should cause me to be more circumspect about the treatment effect. I want to be clear, the treatment effect is still very large, 0.41 standard deviations, that's very large treatment effect. But it is smaller because we're accounting for the uncertainty correctly. If we break it up into teacher and volunteer, we again see that split where the volunteers are much more effective. So now, if I then take fidelity in as an implementation factor, I can see that, so what you really want to do is do fidelity and take up jointly in panel B. So just have M1 times M2 times theta J. The challenge is I have only 3 measures of fidelity. So even though I've checked that the inference has good coverage in simulations, like it's, 3 is a small number. So I would take panel B as suggestive, but it's suggesting that we're looking at massive latent treatment effects. If, on the other hand, we're not happy with doing this 2-factor model on 3 studies, what I can do is break it up for you and say, let's just take the treatment untreated, that takes care of the take-up issue. And then let's do fidelity on treatment untreated. So it's just easier to do the inference in 2 pieces like that when you have small data set. I personally am unhappy that that's true, but that is true. But here, what you're seeing is even when we do that, the average that we're seeing is 0.84 of a standard deviation. That actually is quite close to the largest measured effect in the literature. So by doing this analysis, we're able to replicate the spread of treatment effects that we actually see in the extant literature. That was really exciting to us. So that, first of all, suggests that we're on the right track here and that this is a major part of the story. That by looking at take-up and fidelity, it looks like we could move programs that are on the lower end, still good program, but on the lower end of impact up to the higher end of impact. Now that, of course, assumes that this is a causal effect, right? Nothing I've shown you so far would convince you of that. It could be that these contextual factors actually drive both the M factor, the implementation level, and the treatment effect, right? That's totally possible. But the causal impact of implementation can be studied rigorously because it can be varied systematically. So this is something that you hear academics, I'm sure you guys in this room would not make this mistake, but academics are like, oh, you can't really rigorously measure and change implementation. You're like, well, maybe you guys can't, but actually, people that implement these programs totally can think of ways to measure how well it was implemented and to track it. And they are interested in it. That's what we found. So we were able to do this new RCT, Youth Impact in Botswana, had treatment, had groups that were sorted into treatment and control, and the treatment group sessions actually increased the degree of targeting that was done to the students' level. So additional assessments of the students' learning level, and then tracking their learning afterwards. And the results showed large and significant improvements in learning outcomes relative to the control group, which got the standard youth impact program, which still did good, but we were able to see substantial additional benefits on top of what they've been doing. So just to conclude, we really need to start evaluating implementation. I have other papers as well where we ended up not being able to put in the paper that implementation was a major reason why we saw certain results, but we hadn't thought to measure it ex ante. So it was only by interviewing practitioners in the field that we realized ex post that was true. So we need to start measuring this stuff ex ante up front. Implementation is not a fixed property of an environment or an organization. It's something that can be changed and it can be studied. So in the context of targeted instruction, we saw that implementation almost entirely explains the heterogeneity that we see in effects across context, which is massive. So of course, the cross-study evidence I showed you is correlational, and that's going to always be the case, but new RCTs can be run to then study those correlations. That's sort of how this evidence should be used. These two methods need to be used together. And we hope that the blueprint in this paper will be adopted by others. I just want to emphasize that we can gather and analyze this information. If we don't gather and analyze this information, then we're mostly guessing as to why things succeed or fail or what the treatment effects are. So I'm really excited to hear more about other people's ideas about broadening the scope here or measuring and conceptualizing implementation and policy. Thank you.
All right, thanks so much, Rachael. I know after a drive from Sydney, I just want to sit on the couch and have a beer as opposed to give a presentation of the complexity. But absolutely, I know everyone in the room was completely absorbed by that, and some really key messages that I think really line up, obviously, with some of what Claire was saying in the previous panel, which is great. But really food for us to take together. So look, I know Noam and Rachael are really excited for us to hear from the third speaker, Japoi Panti, Research Manager at Philippine Socioeconomic Panel Survey. And the reason is because Japoi's been managing the Philippine Socioeconomic Panel Survey. It's a leading educational intervention program delivering simple maths instruction by mobile phones. Managing impact evaluation of the conditional cash transfers, a program for the Philippines government, which is, as we know, has got a deep interest in rigorous evaluation of their program. So really excited to hear what you have, and then we'll have the panel and pull it all together in a discussion with the room. Thanks.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Japoi. I'm a research manager at IPA Philippines, and I'll be presenting our paper on building resilient education systems. As you know, I'm one of the many authors of this paper because it takes a village, in this case, 5 countries, to establish a rigorous evidence on a simple, scalable intervention that really works. Before that, though, I'll briefly introduce IPA. So IPA is a sister company of JPAL. We have three main streams of work. We create strong evidence by conducting impact evaluations, and we share the results strategically to our government partners and other stakeholders. And we also make sure to equip our partners with capacity building activities such as training, consulting, and embedded labs. In the Philippines, we started in 2002, conducted over 70 research projects, and one of our main focus areas is on education. So let me talk more about the connected program, or in the Philippines, we call education. So it borrows a lot of principles from teaching at the right level. So we use, as you know, teaching at the right level uses rapid assessment tools to assess students' learning, and then there's a grouping of students based on this, on their learning ability rather than, for example, their age or grade, and then deliver targeted instruction. However, when COVID happened, we shifted, and instead of doing teaching at the right level in school, we adopted it to a phone-based intervention. So the program is really simple. It has two main components. The first one is an SMS we send out on a weekly basis, followed by a 20-minute phone call within the same week. And I think what's different about this is it uses cell phones that are low tech. It doesn't require cell phone or smartphones that have 3G or Wi-Fi. So as long as your phone can receive text messages or phone calls, you can be part of this intervention. So it's fitting in so many contexts, especially, for example, in the Philippines, where 9 out of 10 households have mobile phones. And if you notice, for example, in the Philippines, the other traditional methods of reaching students, especially during the pandemic, are actually lower in terms of availability and use. So how it works is that every week for 8 weeks, you would send an SMS exercise at the beginning of the week. So this SMS exercise contains exercises on foundational numeracy, like addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division. And the households that receive the SMS do not have to respond. The main goal of the SMS is really to engage the parents and the students to work together on school exercises. And then it will be followed by a phone call tutorial. And it's targeted because we only teach one operation per week, and it depends on the level of the student. Suppose a student only knows, based on our assessment, subtraction. So the first week's lesson will be on subtraction, and the student won't move on to the next higher operation until he or she has mastered subtraction. And the good thing about this too is it's only 20 minutes, because typically we only ask 2 questions. The first question is what we call a walkthrough question, wherein the student and the teacher would solve the problem together. And then a check-in question, where the student will have to solve the problem on his or her own. The final good thing about this is the whole time, the parent or the guardian is seated beside the student. So the parent or guardian, for example, would know what appropriate support to provide the student after the lesson. And then, after the targeted instruction, you would schedule with the parent for the next week's call. So it's been implemented not only in the Philippines, but in 5 other countries after it was tested in Botswana. So it was also tested in Kenya, Nepal, India, and Uganda. And as a testament to its rigor, it's already been published, and we have a working paper out. And to cut to the chase, these are the results. So for SMS only, because we did randomized controlled trial for this, for the households that only received SMS without the phone call, the results are mixed. So I think only in the Philippines and Uganda were the results positive. But for SMS with a phone call, across all countries, the effect is positive. And if you notice, there is an increasing amount, or there is an increasing impact from Kenya to Nepal to India to Philippines to Uganda. And one theory is that Philippines and Uganda, for example, this was implemented during COVID, had the longest school closure. So that's one. But another thing is what also Rachael was talking about was on implementation, because the sequence of replication in these countries is also correlated to their impact. It was first replicated, for example, in Kenya, and then Nepal, and then Philippines, and then Uganda. And to check that, we actually have data on targeting. So how targeted the lessons were during the implementation. And we noticed, for example, in the Philippines, the second highest impact, 64%, 65% of the lessons were targeted, and was much higher in Uganda, the last country to replicate it, at least in this paper, with 81.5% targeting, or correct targeting. Another result from this implementation is the impact when it was ran by an NGO and when it was ran by the government itself. So we found no significant difference between the impact when it was ran by an NGO and when it was ran by the government. And this was a bit surprising for us because usually when interventions are adopted by the government because of challenges in program fidelity, the impact becomes lower. But in this case, maybe again a testament to how simple the intervention is and the robust monitoring systems that we have, it can be replicated by virtually anyone who has the resources to implement the program. And finally, the program is really cost effective. Noam talked about learning adjusted years of schooling a while ago. And based on that framework, M-Education or Connected is actually one of the most cost-effective interventions in education because you can imagine the cost is really just airtime and teacher time. So on average, for 8 weeks, we only spent $12 per child, thus resulting to the high cost effectiveness. To contextualize it a bit more, in the Philippines, we piloted it in 3 regions with 110 participating schools and 3,400 learners. And these are the results at the end line between the control group and the treatment group. For context, at the baseline, for example, addition, only 50% of students knew how to add. And at division, at baseline, only around 3% knew how to divide. At the end line, we see that there's a significant difference in the learning between the control group and the treatment group. For example, in subtraction, 44% of the students knew how to divide after 8 weeks, even without an intervention, because they were in class 2, so they obviously also learned in class even remotely. But if you look at the treatment group, 65% of the students who were part of the program, or 65% learned how to subtract. So a 20 percentage point difference in subtraction, similar to multiplication, and 14 percentage point difference in division. So these are very large learning gains. And note that these results are only for 8 weeks of intervention. So 20-minute phone call per week. So around only 3 hours of intervention for 8 weeks. And imagine what can happen if, for example, we increase the dosage of the intervention, say from 20 minutes to 40 minutes, or we lengthen the duration of the intervention from 8 weeks, for example, to maybe 12 weeks or even 16 weeks. So another thing we found after the implementation was that the program was very popular. So 97% of the caregivers reported interest in receiving the intervention again. And we had benefits beyond learning, such as perseverance, ambition, and enjoyment in school. What's exciting now really is we're trying to scale it in the Philippines, and we're also optimizing the program. So we're continue collaborating with the Philippine Department of Education, who also helped us during the pilot. And we've already enlisted more than 100 schools to implement this as part of their remediation approach. And we also enlisted some volunteer NGOs and education partners who are willing to implement the program too, so that we'll be able to reach more students. Because the main challenge here, while the Department of Education has expressed interest, is that we cannot burden their teachers too much. So for example, we're only assigning teachers 4 students per week, because beyond that, it's probably too much for them. So we reached out to universities for their students or pre-service teachers to deliver the program as well. Another one is we're also testing it in a region in the Philippines called the BARM, or the Bangsamoro Autonomous Region of Muslim Mindanao. It's an autonomous region in the Philippines that has one of the lowest learning outcomes. So we're testing that in BARM as well. We just finished our pre-piloting and we'll do the full-scale implementation next year. And finally, we continue to refine the program design through continuous testing. I think this is being done in Botswana by Youth Impact, running A/B tests to find better ways of program delivery and continued consultation with partners and stakeholders in the Philippines as well. So I think that ends our program. If you're convinced or not, please feel free to reach out, and we're happy to answer any of your additional concerns. Thank you.
All right, wonderful, wonderful. Thank you, Japoy. That was fantastic bookend to what we started with Noam and the bigger picture, and looking at various interventions and what's working. And frankly, I found some really surprising results there, which is always great to see. Rachael, some of your sort of flow through the deep analysis on what is really considered conclusion on implementation and testing some of that, and sort of as you noted, some surprising results. And then Japoy, fantastic, really crunchy example from the field about what can work and help us in our engagement with policymakers, particularly in country, but of course donors and others as well. So look, the floor is open for any questions. I think we have the mic passed around if you've got it. I'm happy to kick things off, but yeah, great. We've got a question and then one over there. Thanks. So you want to kick off?
Hello. Hi, Noam. I hope you can hear me. This is a question for Noam. And first of all, thank you everyone for such an insightful presentation. So Noam, you mentioned that one of the metrics used to measure the LACE index is learning outcome. I'm just curious as to how do you measure learning outcomes? And I suppose that it will be based on things like test score. And if so, is there any risk in using test score and in that sense being too focused on academic achievements, especially achievements in prioritized subjects like maths and like other subjects like that? Thank you.
Okay, and I might grab a couple of questions from the floor. So if there's a third question around, thanks.
Hi, Francesca Lo-Davies from ABD Associates. Rachael, I was interested to see in your data that if memory serves, the results for volunteers were almost twice as good as the results for teachers. And I'd be really interested to hear from all of the panelists on what the implications are for scaling. I think I've seen other studies that show different models of teaching at the right level, which involve instructional leadership from school principals and master teachers, and that also really improves the effect. And just thinking through the fact that teacher competence is the most important ingredient in improving learning outcomes, and the quality of teacher competence in a lot of public school systems is still quite poor, what this means for expanding the model. Thanks.
Thank you to all the panelists. I'm Rob Walker at the Lowy Institute, Indo-Pacific Development Center. The question I had, I'm currently just doing a bit of work on Southeast Asia's macroeconomic recovery. And one of the massive things that's coming out is the human development scarring and human capital scarring in the region. And I was just wondering, what's the frequency on the improvements in these learning outcomes potentially in LAYS or other measures that these kind of interventions have? Because my understanding is time is kind of critical here. Like as time goes on, this scarring is going to become more entrenched. So I'm wondering if, for instance, these interventions that you've seen with robust evidence are potentially maybe having this effect on a longer time scale, and maybe shorter term interventions are more necessary in the immediate term or not. So yeah, just any thoughts on that?
Okay, thanks. So the first question was to you, Noam. So why don't you kick off?
Sure. Yeah, so I would say I think it depends on the setting, right? So the settings that we're talking about, kids are learning almost nothing. This is not the scenario of, teach to the test issue, right? This is a scenario where kids can't read and they can't count. So in that setting, I think we should absolutely focus on foundational literacy and numeracy. You can almost not do much else without being able to read and count, right? So these are really foundational skills. I think once you get into kind of upper grades and advanced skills, there's a real question on, the trade-off between academic skills and other things. But I would argue fairly strongly, everyone can be able to read, right, and count. Otherwise, you really don't have access to much in the world. So I don't think that trade-off comes into play in these settings on these skills, I would say. So that's a position I have on that. It's not to say that other skills aren't important, but you need these. These are the portal to the world for many kids. I think on this point on how to recover learning loss and what work, to really make these progress, it is interesting because, for example, both the teaching at the right level, which Rachael presented, and the phone-based program, which Jepway presented, both those things work extremely well, right? They work very well, and they work to recover learning loss, and they work quickly. Actually, those learning gains happen quickly. Yet it is puzzling that at a national scale, there is almost no progress for decades. And so I think the conclusion there, which many people have come to, is the effective things aren't being scaled by the government. Right? So that's the challenge: is there are things that work. How do we get them to be embedded and scaled by the government? That's really, really hard. I mean, that's easy, but that's what we now need to focus on, because we have a sense of things that can work. We're not at a total loss on that. And the challenge now is the scaling and implementation.
Yeah, I think actually the answer to your question almost follows exactly from Noam's question. So when I've been in Botswana, traveling around and going to schools and interviewing both the people at Youth Impact and the teachers in the schools and the principals and the ministers and stuff, my assessment is of the situation is that, because just to be clear, I also was trying to understand why is it that on average volunteers are much more effective, because it's not that they're like, it's not Teach for America. They're not plucked from university. They come from all over. So you'd think like, how could they be on average twice as effective? So I think from my assessment, and this is not in the paper because this is my take, but is that the teachers see this as an additional thing they have to do. They're not given relief from any other duties. They have to also do this. That understandably, I think any of us would not feel happy in the most case to just have something additional given to us. And also, even though, they do see, with the teachers I talk to, they do see the benefit of, like, the kids are learning, they can tell. But the pedagogical approach of targeted instruction is really different to standard pedagogical approaches that are taught top-down in education departments in teacher training colleges. And I think that my assessment is there's kind of a culture war within these institutions of like, are we gonna change, right? As all of you must know, institutional change is extraordinarily challenging. So I think that's the issue. And from people I talk to in Botswana, there is this back and forth of like, we ultimately want to scale up so that this is part of the broader education system so we can get macro gains in learning. That's what everybody wants. The challenge is like, it's very hard, like to do that with teachers is very difficult. That's what we want to get eventually. Do we use volunteers? How long do we use volunteers while we try to change the culture or adjust the teaching load or something like that? So I think this is regime, my take personally, not anybody else's institutional take, is this is regime change. And regime change is very challenging. So I think, you know, if we have any political economists, we'd love to talk to you.
Yeah, I just want to address the question on human capital. So for context, for example, the Philippines ranked last in the PISA assessment in 2018. And yesterday was the result of the PISA 2022. And Philippines was still at the bottom. So there is now a demand from the government for innovations and all these interventions. So we're trying to work with them closely on implementing, for example, the remote or the phone-based intervention. The main challenge really is the bureaucracy, the disconnect, for example, between the central office and the regional offices. But what we've done that we think works is engaging them at the same time because, for example, these types of interventions, the regional offices and the school division offices sometimes have the autonomy to run them. And now that, for example, we've run them in 100 schools that we were piloting, there's now more buy-in that, for example, those schools from the same region have already also enlisted in the greater scale of this project. In terms of immediate gains, there are immediate gains, for example, in teaching at the right level, and then in the phone-based intervention and other interventions that that have been implemented by the government. Sometimes it's really just on the commitment and the follow-through that that matters, aside from also the implementation, because what we've seen also is that there are a lot of interventions that are being proposed by different partners, different funding agencies, and then later on, when there's no more commitment from the funder, then the implementation also peters out. So I think that's something that we should also take note of when doing these types of interventions.
Thanks very much. Yeah, I also did my own regional comparison when Noam put his numbers up, and we beat New Zealand, so that's all I really cared about. And they beat us on so much else. All right, so any other questions? Yeah, please. 1, 2, fantastic. And 3 at the back. All right, so why don't we start there?
Great. So I have one question, I guess, for Noam and Jepwe, because I know you've been thinking about scaling a lot. Do you have any wisdom to share on how, like, what are the general principles you've seen work for trying to scale something? Because we now, as you said, Noam, we know all these great solutions. What have you seen to be the main blocks? And I know, Jepwe, you're working with government and you are trying to scale it. So it'd be great to hear some wisdom. And then just if I can sneak in an extra one for you, Rachael, so you said institutional change is hard. How about in economics? Why don't economists pay enough attention to implementation, and how can we change that?
Hello, this is Monica speaking. I'm from Cambodia Disabled People Organization, work on disability movement in Cambodia. So firstly, allow me to thank you very much for your presentation. So I have one question regarding to the last speaker, regarding, because you have mentioned regarding to the how education work. And I find out you have some few points regarding to SMS, experience, phone call, etc. Because, I wonder, do you have any, best practice or experience how to engage or mention regarding to disability inclusion, something like that? Because when we say about disability inclusion, it's a cutting issue with different diversity of disability issue. Yeah, so the need of people with disability might be different. Like example, like deaf people, they need sign interpreter, and blind, visual impaired, they need a voice or something like that. Because it refers to you have mentioned regarding to how education works. So I just still wonder if you have any guideline or any best practice from that, or any accessibility intervention to help them to fully participation in education, something like that, to make it more inclusive education. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you. Why don't we start with those, and we'll get you up to back at the next round, since we've got 3 in front of us. So I kick off with you, sorry, actually, I'm going to start with the first question. Sorry, it's for Noam and Japoi, my mistake. So, Japoi, can I kick off with you first, and then we'll pass to Noam. Thanks.
Sure. So thank you, Claire, for raising that question. I think one of the things that we think was key in trying to scale this is really to frame the intervention or align the intervention as part of the general strategy, for example, the Department of Education. So now the Department of Education has a program that every Filipino has to be able to read and solve problems at grade 3. So that was a gateway for us to sell this intervention to them, to present this intervention to them. And I think the second one is to engage these government partners from the beginning. So in IPA, for example, we're very big on co-creating research agenda and evidence, and that's what we've done for our education intervention. So right from the beginning, we engage with the curriculum department, with the human resources department. We ask the curriculum department, for example, to review the content of our program, to make sure that it's contextualized to our culture and to our learners. At the same time, we also engaged with the schools because, for example, we know that a lot of teachers have complained about workload. So we made sure that during the implementation, it won't be too much of a burden for them to try on a new intervention just because it works. So I think those are the two key components that we found very effective. No?
Sure. My goodness, how to scale. That's like 10 theses. Life's work, 10 life's work. So yes, I would actually say, I think the one thing to share, so Youth Impact actually is scaling teaching at the right level in Botswana and will be in every school in the country by 2026. So that is the program that we have that's closest to scale and really will be a national scale, which is quite exciting. We've also, of course, been working with the IPA team and the government in the Philippines to scale the phone program. I have a lot of reflections on it. I actually think a lot of the lessons have come from the practice of doing it more than some of the research. Though I think that's because the research is now focusing on scale more and more. So I'm hopeful that over the next few years, there'll be ever more good research on the scaling problem. But a few thoughts. I mean, I think there is a method to this madness also. So one, for example, is I think sometimes when we scale things, we don't start right. And the way you start, I think, really matters. So for example, we'll either start too big, we won't really start small and then stage to the growth. And so it kind of starts too big and then it doesn't work very well. And then people lose faith and then it's sort of dead on arrival. I think that happens a lot. I'm sure people have had that experience here. So that's one. I think the other one is we often get the advice, go where there's highest need. And we've actually found that's really bad advice. And sounds a bit counterintuitive. Why? Of course you want to go where there's highest need. That's so important. But I think the reason that's proved to be pretty bad advice is there's so much need everywhere on these issues that lack of foundational skills is so dominant. Over 90 to 95% of children are not getting these skills. So the issue is an at-scale issue. So everywhere there's a pretty sizable need. So the need heuristic we found doesn't work very well, actually. Instead, what we found is really, really important is where are there government regional leaders who are really keen to try to make this work. And I would say we have found that that's often the exception, but there's one or two, regional directors or whatever the unit equivalent is in every country who want to try to make this work and can. And then when they start and it actually starts working in their region with the government, so this is not a small proof of concept by an NGO, this is a government region doing it through the government in their region, then that can start to really snowball. Then the other regional directors take interest and it snowballs. Now, if you look at the private sector, they use this approach all the time, right? They have early adopters and that is a core part of their growth model. And then there's the next wave of adopters. I'm kind of amazed how rarely we use this approach in the social sector, actually. We sort of we start in a very different way. So I think the way you start is really game changing for the scaling process. That's one reflection. Have we done an RCT on that? No, but we see it very vividly. And I would like to do an RCT on it at some point, actually. And so I think that that's one kind of example that we've learned on scaling. There's more, but I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, that what Noam just said also aligns a lot with what I've observed myself in the field, not just with education interventions, but also like industrial policy interventions and stuff as well. So in terms of why do we think there hasn't been as much attention paid to implementation in the academic literature, I think there's two things going on. So the first is that policy evaluation, especially in the early days of academics being involved in policy evaluation, was hard enough to get RCTs off the ground or whatever. To then say, oh, and in addition, we want to monitor you more than anyone's ever monitored you before. It's just not a good sell. Like, you know, it's hard enough to find people that want you to measure, you know, a randomized assignment of their program. So I think there's some demand side issue, but I also will say, I think this is also an area where academics were more than happy not to push on that, because I'm trying to not use the word bubble, but I think a lot of academics do live in a bubble where our idea is that we tell people what to do and then they do it. And I think there's nothing probably more mistaken and corrosive than that assumption. And so, you know, no, for a long time, just like there's no demand, there's no supply. No, we're not going to have any monitoring of implementation. But I think, you know, it's kind of great that we have any interest in it at all, and any academics that, you know, aren't in a bubble to some extent at least, and any policy people that are like, yeah, like come and assess us, come and evaluate how much we're implementing. We want to get better, or maybe we're doing the best we can and other people can learn from us. You know, so I think now it's kind of like this is the moment to kind of convert that action. So that's where I think the situation is at. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you. Just want to go back to the diversity and inclusion question. So our implementation really focused on first contextualizing the intervention and then making sure that it works. So we haven't had done any tests, or we haven't had any particular interest at that point with diversity and inclusion, but I think what's good about the program is, since it's simple and it's basic math operation, the content is ready. Anyone who wants to adopt it can. And I think the second point is the alternative learning system in the Philippines under the Department of Education also reached out to us, particularly to reach out of school youth and people with disability, so that they will receive this intervention as well. So we're still in the early conversations with the Department of Education on this, but certainly I think it's just a matter of when we can implement it with them on that group of people.
Okay, thank you. We're going to start with a question up the back, and then are there any other questions to come for this round? Get the microphone up the back. Thanks.
Hi. Yeah, thanks for the wonderful presentations. I really like the idea of teaching at the right level. I'm just wondering, it's a great idea, but we know that it's really hard to implement in reality when, you know, you have overworked, underpaid teachers all over the world and underfunded Ministry of Education in most countries as well, and also very little investment in preschool education. And lastly, you know, education, well, not lastly, but least of all, education system that, you know, does not always emphasize holistic learning. And this is true even in countries like Singapore, which, as you pointed out in your research, has one of the highest sort of learning outcomes of a lot of the countries you surveyed. So I'm just thinking, based on the evidence that you have gathered, what are some of the sort of interventions or ideas that you can think of to navigate these sort of structural and institutional challenges? And I know that education seems to be one that you're sort of piloting and testing out, but just really interested in the Philippines context. Anything else that you've learned or even outside of the Philippines that you could share with the broader group?
Thank you. Got another question down the front here in the middle. Thanks. I'm going to add an addendum onto that while we're waiting, which is to say, I've always got an interest as an economist, as we say, in central agencies, right? So, and the engagement between, what I really like is we're hearing about the very practical research and the fact that, you know, I mean, one of the things about research and when it works is doing it in country and having that engagement with policymakers directly. That has, I don't know what the correlation is there, but in terms of effectiveness. But, you know, I mean, obviously we can talk about departments of education and et cetera, but really so often we're actually trying to engage and convince the central agencies, those that hold the purse strings, and empower these Department of Educations with that argument. So any angle on that would be great. Thanks. Sorry.
No, I think I have a sort of similar question. My name's Kate. I'm from an organisation called Delivery Associates, and it's really exciting to hear all the focus on implementation, because that's something that we're really interested in as well, and trying to push governments in particular further away from policy design and further into implementation design and science. I guess I just have a question around a really impressive rigor around the study of implementation there, Rachael, from you, and which I'm assuming, you know, is very lengthy and expensive to conduct. And so I guess I've just got a question around how to get the balance right between that level of rigor and the speed of getting information back into the system so they can make adjustments to implementation on the fly. I think we probably sit on the other end where we don't have enough rigor, but we have a lot of speed. And so, like, I'm really interested in kind of how do you bridge that gap to get some rigor in there, but at a pace that allows for implementation to be to course correct, you know, as it's going.
Sure. So I guess to address that, it feels like all of these questions are kind of related. So, I mean, it is really tough. I think something that I'm excited about, particularly with organizations like Youth Impact, is I think they're also aware of that and looking for like the ability to build these tools into their kind of processes so that they don't have to wait for, you know, someone to come along and conduct a separate external study or whatever. And with the analysis that Noam and I have done and the Bayesian modeling that I was bringing to it, that once we have that and once we're kind of satisfied with it, then it's very easy for other groups to implement as well. You know, once the paper is kind of up, then we can have the code and everything online, and that's very doable. So there's some of that. Obviously, there's then always this issue of like getting people on board. I think that goes back to these other questions of like getting people on board with that and making sure that people kind of have the information that they need and perhaps the training they would need to interpret that information so that they feel a sense of ownership and buy-in. I think that's something else that really came out in the field, talking with teachers and policymakers in Botswana and in other countries that I've worked in. Like, you really need to get people there to feel that they own the change that's happening. So yeah, I see that as really part of it. Yeah, I guess let me hand off to the other two, and if we need to talk more, we can.
Okay, why don't I pass to Noam this time and then to you, Japoi.
Sure. I'm trying to, the one is, I actually would agree. I think this balance of real time and rigor is very tricky to get right. I do this point that Rachael was saying. I think one thing that Youth Impact has developed is this A/B testing approach. I think that is a key to finding that balance. it is randomized, but it's internal, and there's data, and but it's sort of done in this way that is core to implementation. We were able to test that question on improving implementation. We've actually run over 75 A/B tests in the last couple of years, so we're running these things all the time. Claire, who's there, is in charge of a lot of these, and we do it all the time on lots of questions. Some of them we publish. We publish about 10 to 15% of them. Some we don't, because we just use them to learn, and then we move on to the next question actually. And yeah, so I think that's an approach, which the tech sector has used, which I think can come more to the education social sector and can be really groundbreaking for finding that balance. So that's one on that. On the Ministry of Finance point, so it's interesting. Of course, we need the money, right? So we need to work with ministries of finance to support and scale these things. One thing I will say is we have actually had a decent amount of success with ministries of finance, but still it has gotten stuck. So I'll share kind of a quick mini story. We actually had a scenario where the permanent secretary of the Ministry of Finance in Botswana was the former permanent secretary of education. She had signed the memorandum of understanding to scale teaching at the right level. When she moved to the Ministry of Finance, she allocated, $9 million new to scale the program. And actually it was to hire qualified teachers who had been currently unemployed into the system to deliver this approach in dedicated fashion. Speaking to the other points that people had discussed, teachers are overburdened. This was one way of bringing teachers into the system to do this effective thing in dedicated fashion. The money actually was allocated and lined up, but sadly, it never got spent. And the reason was, there was no form to enroll these teachers. The forms office didn't have a form, okay? And we couldn't get a form produced in time. By the time the money needed to be spent down, the forms office resisted even the permanent secretary's request, any attempts to do this. I thought it was a very sad day, but I thought it was a great lesson because it reminded us the importance of procurement and bureaucracy in addition to spending, right? And financing. That sort of the spending the money can be as hard as allocating the money. And I'm sure people here, have experienced that many times over. Anyway, so I think that was an interesting case where we actually had the political will and interest to allocate, but we didn't yet have the procurement and kind of bureaucratic infrastructure in place to spend. What we then did to pivot from there is we realized setting up a new scheme, no matter how exciting, was going to be much harder than leveraging existing schemes. So we then went back to working with teachers and the National Service Program, which deploys teacher aides into schools, and that ended up working. I mean, today actually it's happening throughout the country at very large scale. So kind of working within existing schemes because changing bureaucracy and procurement was so difficult was a real turning point for us. So that was just a comment on that point.
Yes, I just want to address the question on other interventions that might work. So I'm not very familiar with what, for example, the Philippine Department of Education's comprehensive plans are. But right now, for example, they've implemented teaching using mother tongue. So, but that's very controversial at this point. But based on the literature, it should be very effective. But when there were evaluations on the use of mother tongue, for example, there were problems on implementation. So that they've also tried summer camps, but they've implemented it throughout the Philippines right away. And then we didn't find out if it was effective or not. So I think to that point, instead of focusing maybe on these the interventions itself, if there's a way to cultivate the culture within the government system, especially the Department of Education, for example, the culture of innovation, and really just knowing how to properly implement, as Noam and Rachael emphasized, properly implement these programs, not necessarily at a scale at the beginning. And maybe to Noam's point a while ago, to do away with the traditional approaches to supporting students, like giving out laptops and tablets. While they may be helpful, evidence suggests that they're not as cost effective as other interventions. So yeah. And last point, I think, yeah, we recognize, for example, that teachers are overworked, but based on our interactions with a lot of them during the implementation of education, they're also very hungry for these types of intervention. So as long as I think an intervention works, the teachers are willing. So it's really just a matter of how to manage it from the central level.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Unfortunately, we're at time. Thank you, everyone, for your engagement. Absolutely excellent questions. I think you know that these are all recorded, so if you want to go back and look at any of the presentations, they'll be online soon. Thanks again to Claire for pulling this fantastic panel together, and please join me in thanking the panelists. Thank you.